Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest in this episode is the journalist and author James Ball. James has worked for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, The Guardian, WikiLeaks, BuzzFeed, The New European, and The Washington Post, among other organisations. As Special Projects Editor at The Guardian, James played a key role in the Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the NSA leaks by Edward Snowden. Books that James has written include Post-Truth, How Bullshit Conquered the World, Bluffocracy, which makes the claim that Britain is run by bluffers, The System, Who Owns the Internet and How It Owns Us, and, most recently, The Other Pandemic, How QAnon Contaminated the World. That all adds up to enough content to fill at least 4 of our episodes, but we'll mainly be focusing on the ideas in the last of these books about digital pandemics. James, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us, James.
James, what are digital pandemics and what led you to investigate them?
Well, it used to be that when we worried about or talked about computer viruses, we meant something that would lock up your computer or make something weird appear on the screen. But after several years of covering people getting radicalized on the internet into some strange conspiracy group or some strange belief or alienated from their families, I started to see a lot of commonalities in it and also a lot of differences. If you're left-wing, you like to think that only right-wing people believe silly conspiracies. If you're centrist, you like to think it's only fringe people, or people want it to be only men, or only disillusioned people. And I would see these beliefs that you would think would be ridiculous, things like QAnon, things like 5G is being used for mind control, you name it, spread in ways that didn't look predictable. Until I started looking at work like Richard Dawkins on memes and started thinking, actually, if you look at this spreading like a disease from person to person, it makes a lot more sense and it follows what we're seeing a lot more. Radicalization, going to the fringes, if the circumstances are right, could happen to any of us. So just like any of us could catch dengue fever, or almost all of us could catch dengue fever if we went to the wrong bit of the world, or get malaria if we went there. A lot of us could get pulled into this stuff. And so this book was my journey to that conclusion and trying to say what I thought thinking of these things in those terms meant. And of course, because the internet's global, anything that's infectious goes global, and so is a pandemic.
You mentioned memes. I think you mean the original concept of meme rather than just a pretty picture with a clever bit of text alongside it.
Yes, it's sort of ironic given the original idea of meme that the idea of meme has changed. But essentially, a meme is a unit of thinking, a belief. It could be as deep-seated as things like believing in a God in Trinity, but it could also just be a phrase or a poem or something like that. It's a unit of idea as something that travels and evolves and changes. It's a Richard Dawkins idea. It initially seems quite trivial, but when you start thinking about memes being the unit of evolution instead of genes, memes work a lot faster. And so it suggests that we're evolving a lot faster, that there's the potential for change a lot faster. And it's quite a transformative idea when you get into it. Whether you're a fan of Dawkins' other work or not, it is a very significant bit of scholarship.
Do you think that memes are new? I was recently listening to some podcasts about the Dreyfus affair in France, and huge swathes of the French population decided to believe things which were pretty obviously not true. We tend to think that the world is different today and it's never been like the way it is today before. And in some ways, that's definitely true, but in many ways, it's not. People have always believed things that are ridiculous and untrue. News has always circulated very fast. Social media accelerates things, it makes things more global, but I was also reading that 100 or 200 years ago, there were 5 editions of the major newspapers every day. So news was circulating really, really fast. So memes are probably not new. They may be more virulent now, they may be quicker to spread, but this probably isn't really a new problem, is it?
Well, I suppose new is in the eye of the beholder. Genetic evolution is billions of years old. Memetic evolution is about as old as humanity. Memes initially travelled very slowly. We had the oral tradition. Writing sort of helped them sustain and move through generations and spread better. So for all that we might think of writing as slower than speech, writing was a technology that made them faster. Printing then made it much faster. Then the telegraph, then radio, then you name it. And actually, a big repeating trope is that life was getting too fast and as fast as it could possibly be. You can find all sorts of interesting 19th century, 17th century, 16th century texts on how the pace of life is now far too fast and the pace of information is too fast. So memes aren't new, but they are emerging faster, spreading faster, changing faster with technology. If you are a connoisseur of conspiracy theories, as I am, you start to realize that almost all of them, or many, many of them, have some aspect of blood libel in them. The idea that Jews do ritual sacrifices on Christian children. That meme is 1,000 years old. It was born in the 11th century in Norwich, of all places. It's a British invention. Now, it finds new forms, but it's 1,000 years old. That's a 1,000-year-old piece of what we would now call far-right propaganda or far-right misinformation. So you're absolutely right that they're not new in terms of our lifespans, but they are changing faster than they ever did. And they're a lot newer than genes.
Yes, much, much newer than genes. The other thing that you just said I find really interesting is this question about whether change is too fast for people, unaugmented humans, to keep up with. I suspect that was very rarely the case up until the Industrial Revolution, because up until then, after humans had gone through the agricultural revolution and changed from being hunter-gatherers to being subsistence farmers, there wasn't an awful lot of change in fundamental ways in human society. People in 14th century France, most of them lived fairly similar lives to their forebears under the Romans. That all changed with the Industrial Revolution. And I do think actually that now we're reaching the point where unaugmented humans really can't keep up. I think we're reaching the point where Alvin Toffler's forecasts about future shock are coming true or going to come true. And I suspect actually that's the root of a lot of the current wave of populism. But this idea that change is too fast for humans to keep up with, I suspect is probably new since the Industrial Revolution. Do you agree with that?
I'm weakly against it. I think it's certainly true we've changed a lot faster as societies since then, and the volume of information that's there is huge. And also, I'd really love an augment that helped me sort of keep it all. So part of me goes, yes, bring on the augments. But firstly, we tend to think of the information environment we grew up in as a healthy one that was easy to process, even though people say 2 generations before might have found it far too fast. And you'll find that even with technology updates that we now think, well, that was not even fast. Post going up to 4 times a day, I think 5 deliveries a day in London, was sort of seen as transformative and revolutionary. And so I wonder how much of it is actually just it's faster than we personally are used to. But while we think of pre-industrial society as largely unchanging, that was often not the individual experience. If you were a serf and your landowner got killed, if you were a woman raising children and your husband died, if they were conscripted, if they were brought into a war, if they were criminal, people's lives certainly had enough upheaval that they were having to deal with very new circumstances very rapidly. Shocks are usually negative, but not always. But people would still be outside of their experience enough that I think in their lives it kind of happened and there was that much processing. So my inclination is, as we experience it as individuals, we probably, if anything, have more stability now than we used to. And so maybe actually the fact that there is more intellectual processing isn't as relevant as it might first appear.
That's a very interesting observation. But those changes that individuals went through, birth, death, war, famine, plague, etc., they were the same sort of things that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents went through. Whereas the sort of changes we're seeing now, the arrival of radio, television, social media, the metaverse when it arrives. Those are things which our grandparents haven't seen. They may have been able to forecast them, but they haven't seen them. And you're right. I think it's a very good point that our lives are more stable because we don't all die before we're 5. We live much longer lives. There's a lot less poverty in the world than there was and so on. But societally, change is much faster. My hypothesis is that that didn't really happen much before the Industrial Revolution.
But is that not just the messenger technology for the same old events? Our life fortunes are governed by, do we have work? Is our health good? Can we get a roof over our head? Is our country safe and stable? What's our ability in the politics? And so I would say the pace of the messaging, the pace of the information is faster, but actually the events that we tackle are much the same as our grandparents' grandparents. It's same stuff, different wrapper.
So let's move from the past and the present to the possible future or near future. Is QAnon going away? Are there going to be more conspiracy theories? Are they going to have a worse effect? Or are we going to figure out how to deal with them on a day-to-day basis?
I don't see any of this going away. Trump's embrace of QAnon is now firm enough that he's walked on stage to its theme music, and it looks like Mike Flynn, who was very, very briefly Trump's national security advisor in the first term, would go back to that role in the second term as an avowed QAnon believer, to the point where he's made his money hosting a podcast on it. But that conspiracy mindset and that follow the rabbit, do your own research has spread well beyond the US right, and certainly well beyond its fringe. You've had Elon Musk in the last few days, at the time of recording, spreading conspiracy theories that Joe Biden is either very seriously ill or already dead. On the fairly recent assassination attempt of Donald Trump, you had quite a lot of so-called BlueAnon people suggesting that that was a false flag. People very close to Trump's orbit suggesting that it might have instead been a deep state hit on him, etc. If we ever had a phase where we'd put conspiracies out to the fringes, and it's arguable whether we did, especially whether the US did, how many people think that JFK was killed by a lone gunman acting on his own impulse? Not many, I can tell you. If we'd ever got conspiracies to the fringe, certainly in American politics and global politics, they are back.
But some conspiracy theories have some sense to them. There are things that governments kept covered up for a long time. Some of the starting phases of the Vietnam War were deliberately miscommunicated to the American population, for example. So what is the conspiracy theorizing that you think is dangerous and so misguided?
This is, of course, the difficulty. I do try to distinguish conspiracies from conspiracy theories. A lot of my career, I've worked as an investigative journalist, and your job as an investigative journalist is to uncover conspiracies. You often find things that you tell people would never happen. So if you're training journalists, you say, hey, if you're looking into bribery, no one goes, ha, 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 shall we pay this bribe? I'm putting the money in the brown envelope for the bribe. Let's do that. I sort of said, you'll find that it will look very boring, very anodyne, and all of that. And then there was a case I covered where a major oil company had employed 2 former MI6 agents to help it get an oil deal over the line. And one of them just writes in an email to a whole bunch of senior employees, oh, Mrs. E says that he's going to need at least 500 million to bribe everyone down the line, as well as his cut. And it's like, oh, okay, so these things do happen that explicitly. And I will add that despite those emails being involved, etc., the company concerned, who did pay more than $1 billion in facilitation payments of various sorts, was found not to have broken UK law. You know, you do find that conspiracies happen, but they tend to have very clear motivations. They tend to be quite aligned with what an organisation wants or what its public aims are, and they tend to not need very many people to be in on it. And they tend to allow those people to think they're doing the right thing. And you find that in conspiracy theories, those things don't hold. They tend to need lots of seemingly unconnected actors to be secretly working together. They tend to need too many people to be in on it, they tend to need them to be acting in a fairly overtly evil way. Instead of, we'll further democracy around the world by supporting anti-communist dictators or whatever, it's, ha ha ha, we will set up a network to ship children around the world. And so the traits of real conspiracies and conspiracy theories tend to be quite different. But sometimes you can hit on one and find it's the other. And the fact that there is some overlap is, of course, what makes these things so plausible and so compelling.
They are plausible and compelling, and a lot of the people who fall for them are doing so quite innocently, and it's a puzzle often as to how that happened. You mentioned Elon Musk. It's curious how he's fallen for some of these things and doesn't appear to be fundamentally a bad actor. But then you have other people who clearly are fundamentally bad actors, political entrepreneurs. They absolutely know that the theory that they're pushing is a lie, and they do it because they are grifters, they get money from it, they get power from it, and it's a real problem, particularly when they're very smooth. The classic example is Nigel Farage in the UK. Brexit was significantly propelled by his misinformation, but he doesn't do anything illegal, so he can't be prosecuted for what he's doing. Do you have any ideas about how someone like Farage can be dealt with? We don't want to set up vigilante squads taking down the likes of Farage. That's just playing him at his own game. But equally, it's terribly vexing for someone like him to be allowed free rein to carry on doing all the damage he's doing.
I'll come to Farage, but your first point there is quite an interesting one. If people are familiar with the ocean, like the sea model of psychology, the trait that most connects with getting involved in conspiracy theories is narcissism. Narcissism correlates fairly highly with going down conspiracy rabbit holes. People who get into conspiracies tend to have higher than average IQs. And it's that mixture of being a bit clever and being very sure you're right. My profession, investigative journalists, have a big tendency to get into conspiracy theories because if you're good at your job, you have been right when other people have told you you're wrong, and you've uncovered something that people said wasn't true. And so if the dose makes the medicine, you can go down there. So you sort of have people who get in like that, and you have the grifters who get in because it's profitable. But again, psychology, the mask becomes the face. You will find people tend to believe what they're saying when they say it, even if intellectually they must know it's untrue. People like Farage, people who start out pushing conspiracy theories to get money from TikTok or YouTube, tend to end up actually radicalizing themselves as surely as anyone else. So it's difficult to say such people, even Farage, know they're lying. Now, as we're talking, the violent riots in the UK are ongoing. And I think Farage has crossed several lines he usually doesn't, and may actually have put himself in line for some authorities to take a look at it and decide whether they think it's entirely legal. The difficulty with someone like Farage is, as you say, he's legal and he is an elected representative. He's one of 650. His party's only got 5 seats. That's less than 1%. They should expect to be a marginal voice, but they are a legitimate voice. Now, the thing with Nigel Farage is he tends to peak at 15% before he hits his ceiling, where he's appalled so many other people that they won't go better than that. And about 15% of the UK population seem persuadable by Farage. That was his high point with UKIP. That's his high point with the Brexit Party. And that seems to be where he's hit with reform.
Yeah, but Brexit did happen. You got 48% of people to vote for Brexit.
That's because a lot more people than liked Nigel Farage liked the idea of Brexit or were sold on it for a time. But Farage himself, Farage's brand of politics, he hits 15% and then people remember what they hate about him. And he tends to go down from that 15%. And so I think part of it, and it's always the liberal problem, is having enough trust in the people to look at this and say they don't like it, and to vocally oppose him and call him out in effective ways, not in, oh, well, actually, Farage says immigration 600,000, but he's using the gross number and not the net number, and we should use... You just go, oh, this guy's talking nonsense, this guy's talking bollocks, and just show the contempt for him that he deserves. People don't like the kind of messaging he's putting out. Some people do, and you are going to have a thuggish minority in societies. But the way you beat him is to beat him. People like him live to say that they're censored, or live to say that the establishment's too afraid of them to fight fair. And I think generally it's better not to give him what he wants. But I recognise that's a very liberal answer, and people often don't like those.
It's also a real problem because, as you know better than anybody, James, it's easy to throw out 10 lies, and in the time it takes to refute one of them, the other 9 have taken hold, and then there's another 10 coming from where they came from. There's a great deal of asymmetry in Farage's game. He's got unfair advantages. And yes, you're right, he may not get more than 15% of the vote himself, but he had a very significant role in enabling Brexit and making it happen. And he's had a very significant role in making these pogroms happen. And people are being injured, and some people may well get killed as a result of this violence. I take your point that actually the only weapon that liberal democracy has to fight back against Farage is to debunk his lies. But it's really hard. There's an information asymmetry.
There is an information asymmetry. The thing you tend to annoy people as an information researcher, as an author on this, is I always end up quoting War Games, the iconic 1983 movie. The only winning move is not to play. Farage has learned the techniques known as gish galloping, throwing out nonsense claims faster than someone can correct them. It wasn't his trick to do we give the EU 350,000 a week, let's send it to the NHS instead. That was Dominic Cummings' trick. But Farage has learned from that, and he tries that with his million number. And liberals and centrists like to be clever and like to go, well, it's not actually a million. It doesn't work. And no one's forcing you to play his game, so don't. Say your messages, say the better messages, and just go, yeah, that's all cack. If you want to look up how it's cack, there's endless material online. But here's what's more important. He's trying to tell you X, and just move past it. You do see the sort of habit of complaining about the rules of a game that no one has actually forced my side of the argument to play. Now, liberal democracy has a lot of weapons about people who incite violence or incite things harmful to liberal democracy. And even though you've got people like Elon Musk who don't care that their network is being used to incite violence, it won't stop the consequences on the people who are using it. In fact, by putting blue ticks on there, and lots of the sort of far right in the UK buy the blue tick even if their name isn't on the account, Twitter has got their ID, it's got their payment details, and it does hand that over to comply with government orders. Elon will not spend the money to fight these. And also, there's very limited grounds on which they can be fought. So all of these emboldened people are suddenly going to learn that you can get up to 7 years in prison sitting behind your keyboard inciting this stuff. Now, I think Farage, if he is found to have been acting to actively inflame these things, could find himself on the wrong side of that personally. I think he's cleverer than that. I think he'll stop short of that. But we have to then be careful as to what we accuse him of in terms of saying he is saying things that are liable to fan the flames, that are liable to be seized on by others. He's acting grotesquely irresponsibly. He is not doing his job. He is not representing the people. But there are weapons to handle people who cross the line, and I have no problem with those being used. And if Farage crosses that line, then they should be used on him. But if he doesn't, we shouldn't move the line just because we don't like what he's doing.
Sounds like what you're saying is that in order to combat some of these waves of irrationality, people believing really crazy things, it's not sufficient for us just to fight back with clearer information. We need to understand a range of other disciplines, including psychology, you mentioned, understanding what motivates people, what may reinforce people's beliefs despite disconfirmation of what they thought, and I guess sociology as well, what makes ideas spread.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a social sciences graduate, so shock horror, I think the social sciences have use and end up advocating for them. Whoever said that people don't advocate for their own interests? But I mean, one of the more interesting things, and this gets a little bit meta, is that there is good evidence that evidence is terrible at persuading people. Factual, well-evidenced arguments don't move people. And there have been really good studies of this. People have actually managed controlled experiments that do this, as well as sort of natural ones. And it doesn't stop the evidence-based community of all people rejecting that and wanting to use evidenced arguments, which starts to get you in a lovely paradoxical thing. That means that the evidence suggests you shouldn't use evidence and you should move off those arguments.
Or you should use evidence, and as you said, you should amass the evidence and leave it in a place where people can reference it if they want to. But you have to fight memes with memes. And a good example of that working recently is the meme that J.D. Vance and Trump are weird. There's no sort of logical argument there, but it resonates with people because they are weird. And the right is now struggling to deal with that meme. They're trying to fight back, and they can't fight back against it with evidence because it's not an evidence-based claim. It's an emotion-based claim. Trouble is, the right seems to mostly have the better memes.
Well, it's partly because we've almost regarded them as distasteful on the left or the centre-left.
And they are.
But are they?
Yes.
But that sort of ends up looking like you're not very fond of people, because we are moved by narrative. Story is what moves us. Emotion is what moves us.
It's one thing to tell stories. It's one thing to tell jokes. It's a different thing to base your politics on irrational, unfounded emotional claims. But if you have to, if that's the way the opposition is going to play it, I guess you're right. You have to fight fire with fire.
If one side turns up and tells a story and the other side turns up and gives you the annual report and accounts, you're going to find the story compelling. There's almost this habit of blaming everyone else for the failure to tell a story. Surely, if you've got the facts on your side and you've got reality on your side, you should be able to tell an even better story. It should be able to fit. And I think that lack of imagination and that lack of flair has sort of turned into a set of complaints as if, oh, isn't it terribly unfair they tell a better story? It's like, well, no, just tell a better one.
So what are examples of better stories that have taken the energy out of some of these irrational forces?
Callum had a very good one there. The weird narrative has helped. It has cut through. There's a couple of very cheap shots about J.D. Vance that have caught people's imagination.
You wouldn't be talking about couches and socks by any chance?
I would quite possibly be talking about couches, yes. And you do want things that people can't deny. There's a couple of very good essays about you don't want things around smell. I think Orwell wrote a couple of quite interesting things on people who say their opponents smell. It's the unanswerable criticism. It's impossible to sort of counteract. One of the best narratives against communism ended up being queues and shortages. It's a lot more complicated to defend liberal democracy than you get a house, you get a car, everyone in their place. There's a lot that seemed attractive about communism, but the narrative that has managed to go is long queues and empty shelves. And also, if I think of Soviet Russia, I tend to see everything in a sort of tepid, grey, brown sepia. My brain just puts that filter on. That tells you that a narrative has worked well on me. So these things work.
So what's the meme that we could deploy to confound the people inciting and executing the pogroms?
So the ones that I see working well are everyone rebuilding the next day. And you do see those go round and you do see them connect with people because it's also how people want to think of themselves. Especially when you say, this is Britain, this is British values. You don't go, this is humanity, or this is what everyone in the world should do. You want to suggest it's British decency. This is real patriotism. And it works by rug pulling the other side. It's like, no, actually, smashing stuff isn't barriers. You know, we like street parties and tea and this sort of stuff. And so it plays into lots of different narratives at once. And people like to associate themselves with that. And it's also the healthy thing, because you tend to not want counter-protests out. You don't want more people on the street who might get violent. But people going out in the morning and repairing it is good photos, it's good visuals. And you tend to see this stuff. You tend to see quite savvy people try and help it out. In 2017, there was a spate of terror attacks, 4 of them by Islamist extremist killers, and 1 on Finsbury Park Mosque, which is about 5 minutes down the road from where I live. And you saw British Muslims make a point of going to the scenes to do vigils for the victims, to lay flowers, making a point of trying to do community things and to provide meals for police and for other workers, that kind of thing. And that's the kind of messaging and narrative stuff as well. That was them saying this isn't what British Islam is like. You see the more progressive and I think the better and the savvier Jewish and Muslim groups do this when there are attacks or threats against the others. The British Board of Deputies has been quite clear that it's welcomed government support and protection for mosques and applauded the government for doing it. It's deplored the attacks. Those narratives of solidarity are good weapons against it. It is scary when there is uncontrolled violence on the streets. It is small numbers. It is a couple of hundred people, most of whom are milling around and watching the worst dozen in each place. This is not some huge mass movement that's making towns inaccessible. It is sporadic, isolated violence. But because it's, the word they use is stochastic, because it isn't random, but it's stochastic, sporadic violence. And that's very difficult to end. But it's August. People are bored. It's hot. The weather's nice.
And once it starts raining, they'll go home.
Incredibly, unfortunately for us, we are not forecast much rain. It's the one time that we've got a dry August.
Yeah. You're right. At the moment, it's a few dyed-in-the-wool thugs. The people who are going up against the courts are quite often being found to have 16 convictions before, for robbery and burglary and so on. But of course, it's not impossible. It could go down a slippery slope and you end up with something more like Rwanda. Hopefully, we're not going to go anywhere near that in the UK. I would hope not, but you never know. You've talked about how the targeted groups can best handle themselves. You've talked about fighting memes with memes, which I find an attractive idea, although I think, unfortunately, the end result of that is a much worse political discourse than we had before. And you've talked about whether we can deal with the slippery merchants who foment this stuff while remaining legal. What about the situation where you have a friend or a relative who's gone down the rabbit hole, become a maggot, or become a QAnon sympathizer, or become a fan of RFK Jr.? Have you got any good strategies for conversations with those people to try to get them back out of the rabbit hole?
So essentially, prevention is much healthier than cure. And it's a lot easier to help someone as they're starting down than once they're down. And as they're starting out, the trick is don't condemn them, don't attack it, don't get into the argument over it, but try and ask pertinent questions, try and direct, try and go, oh, have you seen this other thing about this? I just thought you might be interested. And try and guide without being oppositional. Conspiracy theories work a lot like cults in that they encourage people to throw off unbelievers because you sort of have to get into it. And so you need to try and be very hard to throw aside. Once someone is radicalized, whether that's in an extremist religion, in the far right, or in a conspiracy, they will only leave because they want to. You're not going to manage some clever Jedi mind trick to pull them out.
That sounds like a council of despair. Is there really no way of...
No, it's a building. But you're not going to suddenly pull them out. What you might be able to do is when they have a crisis of confidence in it, when they waver, if you still have an open door to them, you might be able to get them out at that time when they want help, when they want to leave. And keeping those relations is generally about not opposing them, not getting into it, changing the subject. This is if this is a loved one in your life or a very close friend. And keep the door open, keep the friendship. And so if something happens where they suddenly go, this is all mad, they're all grifters, or how have I ended up here? And they have that crisis of confidence where there's a moment where they might get out of it, you're still there and you can bring them out. And if you talk to people who have left these things, that's how they get out. That's how they leave cults. That's how they do it.
But at that point, they're almost out on their own. It's a terribly sad idea that there's no way to help people who are in.
That's when they can leave on their own. But this is the issue. It's a lot easier to stop someone going in than to get them out once they're in. And once someone is in, there's no guaranteed way to get them out. It's difficult. It's time-consuming. People backslide. I do talk about this in the book. Once someone's in, it's months of work to get them out, and only if they are a willing participant. Radicalization is very tricky.
So if prevention is easier than extracting people who are already infected, what is the key to prevention?
I tend to believe in inoculation. I think if people have encountered some of these memes and some of these ideas before and sort of know a little bit about it, it's not quite as compelling when you first hear it. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about people like Jeffrey Epstein and their elite circles and kind of go, hey, this is what this real thing looks about. We shouldn't be afraid to sort of introduce, is it stupid to worry about 5G? What actually is 5G? How's that there? And talk about some of this stuff in general, because usually the first you ever hear of it is from a conspiracy place. And actually going, what is it? How does it work? The fairly simple thing of 5G is exactly the same kind of thing that's in your microwave. And so would you stick your hand in a microwave and turn it on if you could? No. There are some dangers to it, and we understand how they work. It's the same thing that's in an MRI. Having those conversations and sounding relaxed, if someone then runs across what they're not telling you about, you're not sort of, oh, why have I never heard about X? You know a bit. So does that. There's things like a lot of ideas like QAnon spread, not because of 4chan or 8chan, but because suddenly it started being good YouTube content. People who made videos about other stuff realized they'd get a bigger audience and more money talking about QAnon. Now, you can, without banning speech, demonetize it and go, this topic's not suitable for advertising. And that removes the incentive of the cynics that we were talking about to jump into it. So believers can still say what they want. You're not at that edge of going, we have a board that decides what is legitimate political expression and what is not. But you can demonetize. You can look at critical thinking. You can look at that role in education. And so I tend towards pull a lot of levers a little bit and you'll get a better result than going, here is the one big thing you could do. And if you fix this, it all goes away. There's lots we can do. That's where I find some hope in it. The absence of a big magic fix is sad, but what big problem in society actually has a big magic fix? There are lots of things that can work.
So thanks for that advice, James. I know your book has lots more advice. I know your book has some incredible narratives, engrossing, alarming narratives, but I know also it has some hopeful, optimistic, upbeat thoughts in it too. Thanks for sharing the time with us, and I do encourage people to dig more deeply into your writing.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, James. I've lost some friends to the rabbit hole, and so I'm going to carry on looking for some Jedi mind tricks.
I shall hope that you find one or two. Please teach me if you do.
It will do. Thanks very much for joining the London Futurist podcast.